Thanks for the invite to come today. I want to talk about something that I've been working on for 13 years now in Canada and has some pretty important implications for folks here in the U.S. as well. These invasive wild pigs. There's a long history of this in the southern U.S., but normally and historically the northern U.S. states have had little to nothing to worry about with respect to wild pigs. But that changed as pigs have grown and expanded here in Canada. So let's just go through some of the research we've been doing over the last 13 years and what are the things we might be able to do about it. First of all, what is a wild pig? Can cover a lot of different ground here. We often use the term wild boar, but I think that's incorrect. Really, we have wild boar in Canada that were imported to be raised on farms. But we also have potbelly pigs, which are increasing. This is another issue, almost in another entire presentation, really. And this is mainly tied to the pet trade, but we're seeing lots and lots of people adopting small pigs, trying to get their photo for Instagram and the selfies. And then they get quite large and don't know what to do with them, and they get dumped in the wild. And so these are actually going to become a big issue. And we're seeing, for example, this one on the bottom left was actually just outside of my home city of Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan. And they was harassing the horses so bad that he had to shoot it. And those horses didn't settle down for about 4 or 5 days. So domestic potbelly pigs. We also have some free-ranging hangover pigs, I might call them, that are still pink pigs. This could be 100% Yorkshire animal with no wild boar in it whatsoever running around the landscape. These will obviously cross with all of the above, and as we know, pigs are very much a love the one you're with kind of species, and so any of these will very much interbreed and you can get all sorts of hybrids of them as well. In your bottom right there, you see a night photo. And those two in the front are sort of classic wild boar type looking animals. I think we can agree on that. Behind them is a nice shiny pink Yorkshire pig. No wild boar whatsoever. This is a Yorkshire pig that was a free range pig that just, for whatever reason, a bunch of them got ignored and left out into the wild. And they joined up in the wild with these other ones. And then in the back, you see a spotted one, which is surely obviously a hybrid of the two. And this sort of group, we technically refer to this as a shit show of wild pigs. It's a bit of a, frankly, there's been some pretty not great things happen to get us to this point. We shouldn't have any free-ranging pigs running around the land for sure. We shouldn't have wild boar out there, and we certainly shouldn't have those hybrids. And so this mix of them is very complex, and that's why we use the term wild pig. That's the catch-all for all of the above, and all of them are important, and all of them breed and interbreed, and they all spread, and they all love agricultural crops, they love gardens, they move into cities. They are a real nuisance. And to be really clear, these are the worst invasive large mammals on the planet. So when people say, well, Ryan, what could be worse? The media always asks that. We want the really juicy story. What might be worse? And I'm like, nothing. I can't think of anything on the animal side that could be worse than having wild pigs. Some work for Jesse Lewis and others did a map update in 2017. This is already needing some update, but you can see the global range. The only continent you will not find wild pigs on is Antarctica now, and they have massive range. They're native to Asia and Europe and a little bit of North Africa, but they've been introduced to literally hundreds of islands around the world, and Australia has something probably north of 13 million. They're really struggling with their wild pig problem. They have expanded dramatically even in their native range. France kills 300, 400,000 a year. One year they killed 1 million wild pigs, and the population didn't really go down. Once you get a big established pig population, it's essentially impossible to get rid of it. And so really the only option is dealing with it early on. Not unlike cancer cells, not unlike forest fires, and not unlike a house fire. Once it gets established and it's spread, there's not much you can do. Where I grew up in a rural area, our volunteer firefighters were often called the basement savers, because by the time they got there, about the only thing left was the cement foundation of a house. And it's just too little too late, right? And that's exactly what happens with pigs. When they get established and they're there, you don't really talk about eradication anymore. You talk about living with pigs for the next 500 years. So that's the range. Of course, the U.S. has had a 300 or 400 year history of them as well. They were brought over by the Spanish. And, today there are very few places in Texas or Florida, many of those southern U.S. states that have any freedom from them. They're widespread and abundant. Texas probably has somewhere between 3 and 4 million of them. And so historically this was, and in the last 30 years it's really exploded even in the southern U.S. So it is a big southern U.S. problem. But historically, we didn't, as I said, we don't really think of the Michigans of the world or the Montanas or the North Dakotas as being much of a risk. But one thing we do know about wild pigs is they sort of move at two speeds. They either move at 5 miles an hour on their hoof, on their own, or they move at 65 miles an hour in the back of a pickup truck. And that's really the two things I think that Michigan needs to think about, or Michigan and Montana and Minnesota and a lot of other states, is think about these on the hoof coming down from Canada or coming north in the back of a pickup. And there's been a number of cases where one guy recently, they pulled over on an interstate highway, had bought a minivan, gutted it out, and it was stuffed full of 11 wild pigs from, I think it was from Texas or something. And he was going to set up a hunting operation, let them go and hunt. And this happens in a number of places in the U.S. and I think a little bit in Canada, where someone takes some domestic or some kind of wild boar type, wild pig type animals, dumps them in an area, and then comes back the next year and knocks on the farmer's door and says, "Hey, I heard you have a problem with wild pigs. I'm a hunter. I'm here to help. I can be your best friend." And they go, "Wow, that's perfectly coincidental. We've just started seeing them on our farm." Well, yeah, sure you did, because I let them go there the other day. And so releases are an important problem that show up because people want to hunt them. People love to hunt them. Up in Canada, they're often referred to as the poor man's grizzly because it's one of those species that if you shoot at it and don't kill it, they may come and try and kill you. And for some, that's a real thrill, right? Shooting whitetail is a little bit boring because they probably will just run away. If you go on YouTube, don't do it right before you go to bed, but go on YouTube and look and search wild boar or wild pig charge, and you will see people shooting at these things, and they'll come right at you and really try and take you out. I know in Canada, some of the teams that go in on the ground with rifles, they actually have 2 or 3 people with them with 12-gauge shotguns, and their job is to protect the shooters for when the pigs charge. So they can be quite dangerous. But here we have this distribution, and then we have some pigs up here, way up north in Canada. And so we see this weird distribution, right? We see these southern pigs. In 2004, the USDA invited me to come down to a conference in Alabama, and the presenters were saying, well, as we all know, pigs occur in the southern U.S., and they can't survive a cold winter. And as we know, this is a southern problem. And everybody said kind of the same thing. And then I went up and went click, and here's these pigs living in the coldest parts of Canada, where, I remember a time where we had 38 days straight where it was never warmer than 30 below, period, for 38 days straight. In the Canadian prairies, a week or 2 or even 3 of 40 below is not unheard of. And so we have this extreme cold. And a lot of people said, well, no pigs are going to survive that. But guess what? They do quite well. This is an early photo from a farm in Manitoba from 1982. And it was about these newly established wild boar farms. But they actually say, if you read it, pork products from these crossbred wild boar pigs. So those were already crossbred back in 1980. So we had these hybrids. So in fact, on most farms and pretty much everywhere in the wild in Canada, if you find a pig inside a fence or outside a fence, probably some kind of hybrid. Very, very few pure wild boar, even despite what many might tell you. And so it started in the 80s. There's a farm that we visited just outside of Saskatchewan. And this was way back when I was just starting to study them. And so we went to visit this farm just to see them and ask questions. And we were inside and I was taking photos like this. And he said, oh, by the way, I almost forgot. If you pick up one of these piglets, every animal in this pen will be on top of you and you'll be dead in less than 10 minutes. Good to know. Thank you for that. These things are big. And even though he hand raises them and he visits with them, they can be quite dangerous. And of course, with the sharp tusks and that going on, they are not without risk and can be exceedingly aggressive as well. Started with these boar from wild boar, crossed with domestic pigs, escaped, and then we had all of these people cutting fences. The market peaked in 2001, and when it crashed, it just never took off. We didn't develop enough to ship big container loads to Japan and establish a big, huge market with lots of fancy restaurants. And so the market kind of fell off, which does happen, unfortunately, with a lot of these exotic type farming, is there's a big push to buy in and, buy breeding stock for tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, like the elk industry happened to, very similar as well, and then the bottom falls out. So this is what happened. And people cut fence and let, in some cases, more than 300 animals go. We look here at this. This is our agriculture census data that shows 2001. This is the peak of what it looked like in Canada. This is ag census data for wild boar farms. At the very peak, we had 500 farms with 32,000 animals on farm, according to Stats Canada. And you see Western Canada. Where am I going here? I'm all over the map here, trying to use my laser. You can see Western Canada here. Of course, our friendly neighborhood, Minnesota's right down there. I should have that on the map, but it's right down here for context. But Western Canada was the big producer. And there's our Manitoba, and that is literally butting right up against Minnesota right there. So there were farms right there. This is particularly notable, this square right here. That was a very high production place for domestic wild boar farms, and is currently by far the hot spot for free-ranging wild pigs in Canada. So no coincidence there. This is the source. We're really not aware of any pigs coming from the U.S., naturally or otherwise. This is really very much a release and escape from farms. Now, a little bit of terminology. If you see a group of pigs, they usually refer to it as a sounder, led by a mature female who's the boss and leads the way, and mostly female offspring of hers. So her daughters, great-granddaughters, and great-great-granddaughters. And typically in a sounder group, you're going to see almost always young at heel. These things are constantly reproducing, constantly squeezing out young, and so very high reproductive. I often refer to them as wild pig factories. And if you do the math on this particular group that I got a photo of, the total weight adds up to a little bit more than the weight of an F-150 pickup truck. And so if you think about the weight and size and aggressiveness and razor-sharp tusks, how many pairs of razor-sharp tusks, one of the questions I always get is, well, our wolves will take care of that. Really? Your wolves are going to take on that? I'm not sure I agree with that. There's really no evidence that wolves have any limiting factor so far, at least in Canada, anywhere that I'm aware of. Maybe when they move into the boreal forest where they have established wolves, and I've seen packs of 24 in my time, maybe then, but when you get these big sounders, they're super smart, super aggressive, large. Certainly not going to save the day if that's what anybody's hoping for. Reproduction is high there. What we call, continuous breeders, as this group is well aware. They're, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days. We don't really know what weaning looks like in nature exactly. Probably on the order of 4 to 6 months, and then they're sexually mature, and then they're reproducing as well. And so, a producer in southeastern Saskatchewan tells a story. Truck slid off the ice in the road, crashed 11 domestic wild boar got out. His wife called him and said, we got these out. And he's like, what are you talking about? Who cares? Why are we worried about this? Well, eventually they got around. They shot 7 of 11. 4 got into a provincial park. And over the course of 3 years turned into about 120. And so this comparison to a cancer cell or a forest fire, I think, is really appropriate in that you have exactly one chance and one way to get rid of this. You have to have early detection, and you have to have a really rapid and super aggressive response. There's really no other option. Unfortunately, in Canada, we haven't seen that anywhere in terms of good detection or rapid response. It's been a pretty slow. These were first detected in 93, and we've seen them kind of explode out of control. In the last 3 years, we've seen some pretty significant efforts to try and get in front of it, but reality is, and not pointing fingers at any individual or any organization or anything, but the reality is, for the most part, it's been way too little, way too late. And so these numbers have just continued, growing. And since the time I've been talking to you, there's probably been at least one litter has hit the ground. And by the time I'm done, there'll be at least another one or two more litter born. And these things are just constantly reproducing. So that reproductive rate is one of their big factors. And that, they, at about 4 to 6 months, they lose those cream-colored stripes. And that's about the same time they become sexually mature and start having young of their own. So reproduction is a huge driver. We often call them super pigs because a domestic wild boar has nowhere near the size and typically the size or the reproductive output of these hybrids. And so unfortunately that hybridization, which was a really good idea on farm to get bigger animals. Of course, a domestic pig has an extra set of ribs compared to a wild boar, so you get a longer pig, you get bigger litters, more frequent litters, all the good things that were bred into our domestic pigs that moved into the wild boar was great for production, but unfortunately it also meant that they became that far superior as an invasive species as well. They're hard to spot. You can't fly aerial surveys. Up in Canada, we fly back and forth kind of like a lawnmower and count our moose and elk and deer and then kind of do a model and say, we think we have about 2,500. Pigs spend a lot of time in winter underneath the snow, especially when it's cold. Not only are they furry and big, but a big advantage is they actually tunnel underneath the snow, which has huge insulated properties. Much like Inuits have used and continue to use igloos, they get under that snow and they stay warm. In fact, one way we can actually find them is if you get a really crazy pilot that will fly really slow at first light in the morning when it's 40 below. You can actually see they're so warm in there, you can imagine a dozen pigs jammed underneath 3.5 feet of snow. There's literally steam pouring out of that hole, and you can actually spot the steam, and that's one way to find pigs in winter. This particular group of pigs is actually, well, you can't see anything at all. I have to trust me, but one of these is a female with a collar and a bunch of young, and in fact, there are 8 pigs. I think there's one tucked, we're pretty sure there was one tucked in there. But they're actually buried under the vegetation. They've just piled up and tunneled in, and they're totally covered with plants. So you can fly over all you want. You can fly with infrared cameras and use all the tools you want. But without the collar, we would have never known she was there. This is that exponential increase that we've seen in terms of observations. We've been tracking observations for full 13 years now. We're well into year 13 or 14 now. Across all of Canada using a whole bunch of methods. And I think, I don't know if I have the citation for the paper. I think it comes up. But if you want to read about how we use trail cameras, reported observations, GPS collars, lots of media reports, even still today, if you see a wild pig, and if you happen to get a photo, chances are it's going to be in your local paper, might even be front page news. So lots of media reports and so many different ways to know you have wild pigs, but certainly see this exponential increase. And some people said that's surprising. I would strongly disagree. I would say it's shocking. I would say that it's disappointing. I would say it's damn near really concerning, perhaps even alarming. But this should not be surprising. This is exactly what wild pigs do, right? Chris Rock, the comedian, had this bit that he used to do where he talked about the tigers, those white tigers in Vegas, and one of them badly bit one of their trainers. And people were saying the tiger went crazy. And he said, no, that tiger did not go crazy. The tiger went tiger. The tiger did exactly what the tiger evolved to do. And it went for some meat and it attacked someone. Well, this is exactly what pigs do. Anywhere on the planet where you throw these pigs out, where it's a small island in the Bahamas, or you throw them in Hawaii, take them to Canada, the US, Australia, anywhere they've been released, this is exactly what they do. No surprise. It would be shocking if they didn't do exactly this. And which is, of course, exactly the kind of thing we see with a forest fire, the kind of thing we see with a house fire. Someone calls and says, 911, I got an emergency, oil just spilled, my kitchen's on fire, oh crap. That goes from the kitchen to the living room, and all of a sudden, within minutes, that entire house is ablaze. And same with a forest fire. You've got exactly one chance. With forest fire, you spend a lot of time and money flying looking for smoke. Smoke spotters are in the air. Satellites are tracking. All of a sudden, someone calls in and says, holy crap, I see smoke. And all of a sudden, water bombers fire up, and they are on top of that smoke and get it out. That's the only chance you have. Once you've got an out-of-control fire, there's nothing you can do about it. And so this is, unfortunately, what's happened in Canada, at least in Western Canada, is we've seen this exponential increase, big spread. 60% of the occurrences are in the last 5 years. So it's really, truly been exponential. And so, of course, what do we expect for the future under current conditions is exactly. And so in a few years, we'll be somewhere, I don't know if you can see that spot up on the ceiling. I think we'll probably be up there. This is distribution. This is not, or occurrences. This is not, we don't have a good estimate of actual numbers. Say, Ryan, how many pigs we have? The reality is we don't really know. It's a lot. It's thousands. But the way they live and the way they hide on us, you can't just do regular surveys. So we don't have great numbers, but we know we have a lot for sure. And we're sort of the only ones, as far as I'm aware, that are doing this kind of mapping in Canada. We've been doing it for a long, long time. As I said, over 13 years. And so when Ruth Asham started she started doing her master's with me many years ago, and then ultimately it was such a big I said, when she started, I said, Ruth, I'm not sure we have enough wild pigs in Canada to actually do a master's. We need a backup plan. But then she started digging in and talking to people and going to wildlife meetings and mapping where pigs were, collecting trail camera photos. And we put out our first callers and we found, wow, there are a lot of pigs. And so there was actually so much she converted to a PhD. But what we see here in this particular map are the very early days where each of these little red blobs is a watershed. And we use what we call a level 9 watershed. Watersheds scale from 1 to 13, I think, different sizes for different purposes. We chose level 9 because that little red blob is about exactly the same size as a home range of a pig. If you put a collar and track it for a year, that's conservative. It's actually probably a little bit bigger, but it's a good estimate of the home range size of a pig. And so we have a few red blobs where we have those watersheds. Of course, watersheds literally cover the entire country. Back in the 90s, based on all the data she collected, they said, well, yeah, there's a few out there. And you could see why a lot of people at that point were saying, Ryan, Ruth, what are you worried about? This is not a big issue. But again, if you don't equate it to cancer or fire, or if you think about this as relatively benign and don't understand the ecology, then you're perfectly fine. I will say, though, we started talking to some folks in Texas. And one guy said, Ryan, I don't care what you're doing. Don't tell me what you're doing because I couldn't care less on other stuff. You and anybody you know, drop what you're doing right now and go start removing pigs and do not stop until they're all gone. Because you could tell me whatever you're doing, but I'm going to say it's a lot less important than what needs to be done with these pigs. Because again, early on, this is when you have a chance to eradicate, right? If you ever see a map like this in Minnesota, and there's a few pigs here and there, that's alarming, but it's also a huge opportunity. Here we had a very, very, very real opportunity to eradicate and keep Canada wild pig free. In the next snapshot here from 2001 to 2010, now we see quite a few watersheds spread over a big area, right? This is 500,000-600,000 square miles. I'm using my microphone. So again, not a lot, but widespread enough to be quite concerning. And again, this is what we call the Canadian prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. A few in BC, but as we see here and as we'll see ongoing, that really it's the prairies here. It's this area that's the overwhelming part of the problem, keeping in mind again that Minnesota is right knocking on the door right there. Now, by the time Ruth finished her data collection in 2017, we saw a lot of watersheds. Now, I want to point out here that they turn red even if there's one occurrence of a wild pig. So maybe it's one, maybe it left, maybe it died, but maybe there's more. And so this was just presence absence. So we're going to expand and improve on that. But when we talk about something that can reproduce really quickly, one pregnant sow can translate into an awful lot of pigs really quickly. So presence matters for sure. But it also doesn't mean we're overwhelmed with numbers by any stretch. But here we are now, 2023. This is an updated map. I did add Minnesota as a friendly reminder. I pointed that out a few times already. But already we see central Saskatchewan, the southern half of the province, has lots and lots of pigs. Ontario started looking about 3 years ago, and we're pretty shocked how much they found. There's a few in Quebec. Probably one established population, a few occurrences in BC, which are concerning, but none of those appear to be reproducing. So probably not a big concern. But as of this map that I made just before I came here, we had just over 60,000 occurrences across from 1993 to day before yesterday. And 99.44% of those are in the prairie provinces. So Ontario has an issue, but again, they're in a position where they can get ahead of this, and they absolutely could be wild pig free and could stay so. The Yukon had a couple of outbreaks up here, not much to speak of. BC has had occasionally. Ontario and Quebec, there's been one or two spotted in Atlantic Canada on the East Coast. I would say, in my opinion, that those provinces, as long as they are diligent and develop a strategy and follow some of the guidelines, they can get in front of this and either become wild pig free and stay pig free, or if they don't have any, stay pig free. So there's a good positive there. There is no chance of eradication here. They're so widespread. I mean, this is 1 million square kilometers. So what does that translate into? Almost 700,000 square miles. That's bigger than most countries. I think if this range was translated into a country, it'd be like the 27th largest country in the world. So I think that, well, to be perfectly blunt, and I'll repeat my bluntness again, if anybody tells you we can eradicate wild pigs in Canada, then they fundamentally misunderstand what's going on. There are still people saying that, and some will vehemently disagree. But I think that would be fair to say that's a very, very naive position to say we're eradicating. They're here. Can we do something about it? Yes. Can we do lots about it? Yes. Does that mean that Minnesota should be thinking long and hard about what this map looks like? Also, yes. Here's the prairies without boundaries, because of course pigs don't recognize boundaries. There's the prairie provinces. And the red are now, as of 2023, where we've had occurrences, but also importantly, we've added where we have evidence of reproduction. We call that established now. And those blue areas are, where we have seen reproduction. And typically the US and Canada agree that once you have reproduction, then you're very comfortable in calling that an established population. And importantly, in Canada, each of the 3 prairie provinces has what I call a stronghold of pigs. That is, probably 50 to 85% of all of the pigs in that province are in one of these circles. And so in Alberta, there's a big city called Edmonton, and north and west of Edmonton has traditionally been a stronghold. It's actually expanded probably about almost 70 miles now to, in fact, where they're actually they're out flying today looking for pigs to hopefully capture in this area down here. So this area is expanded, but that's a stronghold with a big majority of those pigs. In Manitoba, and this is particularly important, I think, for where we're speaking right now, in southwestern Manitoba, there's a major stronghold. And the distance between that and the U.S. border, probably about 45 miles. And those pigs can cover that in a couple of days, for sure, if not a single day. So I think this is particularly concerning when you got a really high concentration here. And then finally, in Saskatchewan, inside this yellow circle, there's more wild pigs inside that one yellow circle than the rest of Canada combined. That is a massive, massive hotspot. It is a massive wild pig factory. And since we've been talking, there's been at least 2, maybe 3 litters probably dropped on the ground in that area. So this thing is exploding and is truly out of control. And that has important implications also because what I call the 2-pig problem. It's like fish or cut bait. Do you focus your efforts in those yellow areas where you can find lots of pigs and kill lots of them? Or do you look at some of these other areas where you've just got the occasional pig showing up? But if that's a sounder group, that sounder can start reproducing and become a hot spot very, very quickly. If Moose Mountain can go from having 0 pigs, 4 show up, and 3 years later there's 100, what did I say? I think it was 123. The capacity for any one of these red dots to explode out of control is also there. So I would say that it's not an either or, and that we have to focus on these strongholds and live with pigs, and then in an ideal world, zone these areas and really focus on removal and control, especially in our high-value areas. And so, we were talking over lunch about how down in, where are we here in Manitoba? Yeah. So this area of Manitoba has relatively few pigs. And this is, keep in mind, this is over I think that's 11-year period. This area is a high concentration of some of the biggest hog barns, a lot of concentration there. So my suggestion would be, this is a stronghold. That's going to be tough, but this area could be called a wild pig control zone and put a lot of emphasis saying there's not many pigs. wild pigs, but there is a really high value, millions, billions, I don't know the number, how much the value of those big domestic barns are worth. And so as a priority item, I would say setting this off and making it wild pig free and saying, whatever it costs, I don't care what it costs $5,000 a day or whatever to have a helicopter on standby, trail cameras, people monitoring, whatever that program looks like to make sure if a pig shows up and someone spots it in the morning, it's dead before supper. This is what it looks like associated with all those black dots are wild pigs, and that's agricultural cropland. We haven't seen pigs really much outside of ag cropland so far because I think they need those calories in order to survive the cold. Here's a collaborative map. We've been doing a lot of work with the USDA. Virtually all of the research I'm talking about today has actually been funded by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So far in Canada, I haven't received any substantive research funding for wild pig stuff yet. It's really, if it wasn't for the USDA, this would be about a 35-second talk, and then I'd be done. I wouldn't have a lot to say. All the students and the collaring and much of that work has been because of a partnership with the USDA. We're just not seeing a lot of interest or support or much in terms of the science in Canada yet. It's a bit of a black hole, to be honest. But we have done some work funded through the USDA, and we made a wild pig book. If you want to read about wild pigs, we've compiled a book and we made some maps. And so we took all the data we had that Ruth had compiled for the presence of pigs on the prairies and looked at, in this particular case, sort of west central North America. And you can see Minnesota, they've had some wild pigs that were removed. North Dakota's had some substantive issues, but they, as far as we can tell, have eradicated those. But you start to get south and you see, okay, there's a pretty big pocket down there. And that is not a far drive in a pickup truck. And this is not a far walk for a pig on the hoof. And so those are sort of the two concerns, I think, from Minnesota. Can pigs come down from Saskatchewan and Manitoba through North Dakota into Minnesota? Very possibly. So those are the big risks I would identify, saying, I'm not in the business of telling people what to do, but I am in the business of telling people what the science says about pigs and where they go. And I am in the business of raising red flags and warning what happens if you don't do anything. We've done some habitat modeling. So Corey Kramer did his master's with me, and we use collar data. And there's the great state of Minnesota right down here, of course. And you can see, unfortunately, the darker the brown, the higher the risk of pigs. So here in Manitoba, we have some across the Canadian prairies. And in fact, the big movements down into the Dakotas and indeed into Minnesota. So the bad news is that the possibility of them moving, and there's no real barriers, right? A river is not a barrier. They can swim like gangbusters. They swim between islands in Hawaii. We've seen them in the middle of the largest lake in southern Saskatchewan with 4 piglets on their back swimming across. Somebody thought it was a log, and they raced out there with their boat to haul it to shore, and it was a bunch of pigs swimming across the widest part of the biggest lake with piglets on their back. So unfortunately, there is no real boundary, and the potential for them moving here is very, very real. There's another map showing, where 95% of all the pigs in Canada are in this image. So really, the overwhelming majority is in Saskatchewan and Manitoba and some down here. So big concerns with respect to U.S. states. I would say virtually zero risk. The good news is that most of the western part of Ontario has no pigs, as far as we can tell. They have them, but they're quite a bit. And of course, Ontario is a really big, wide state. And so the risk of pigs coming in from over here is effectively zero, as far as we can tell right now. That could change, but so far, the big risk is either Saskatchewan, Manitoba pigs coming down through the Dakotas or coming straight down where we share a border right through there. Thankfully, again, I'm estimating where your great state ends, somewhere around there. So you're still not right in the hot spot, but again, that hot spot, I started this with a big, thick head of brown, luscious hair. So gone a little bit gray and lost a fair bit. My son always goes like this. Dad's got a 4-finger forehead, and I blame a lot of this on wild pigs. If you're interested in kind of learning more, we have a very active Facebook page. For the Canadian prairie provinces where we have, established widespread problems, I've developed these Google Earth files you can download for free. You can install them on your phone, your tablet, your computer at home. You can even put them on a GPS. And you can actually zoom in and around these. You can search and you could type in where your farm is or where your favorite hunting spot is or where you live or whatever. It will take you there and then show you these layers where known pigs are. And you can turn the layer off and zoom in and look at the satellite imagery underneath and search and move and zoom in, zoom out, and all that sort of stuff. So that's a really important risk layer that we can use to understand where pigs are at a fairly broad scale. We actually don't want to, I don't typically share any information at finer scales, because if I went on there today and said, hey, Jim just spotted 11 pigs in his backyard this afternoon, before nightfall you would have dozens of trucks circling. Everybody wants to shoot them. They're very, very popular. But these interactive maps you can download for free off our Facebook page there. We're called the Wild Pig Research Project. Another quick thing I want to touch on is that there are still sources out there. So this is you guys have Craigslist, I think is a big deal in the U.S. We have something called Kijiji, which is essentially the same thing. You want to sell your old umpire uniform or your old ballerina dress or your tennis racket, you put on Craigslist, right? Well, here we put it on Kijiji, but you can actually buy all manner of wild boar, wild pigs, teacup pigs, mini pigs, a bunch of different breeds for sale in Canada. So the red is that range that I already talked about. We just did a very quick 60-day look, and we found over 60 days 153 adverts in the summer of animals for sale. And this is all designed purposely to keep this all confidential, right? So I don't have to put in my name, my phone number, anything. I can just back up my truck, hand you $300 and get a bred sow or a sow and a couple males or whatever. And you can say, I want a potbelly wild boar breed. I want wild boar type. I want wild boar crossed with Duroc landrace. You can pretty much pick what you want in almost any province. And you throw them in your truck and away you go. You're either in the wild boar business to farm them, or I don't know that a lot of these get released. I think this is more back to the landers that want to raise these as for meat primarily. But a lot of these folks have little or no background in agriculture and don't necessarily know how to build a fence. They may not know how to spell biosecurity. And if they get away, they maybe don't care, right? These aren't producers that are in it for the money. These people work full-time, almost always. They have money, often fairly wealthy. They've moved out of the city into the country. This is not about making money. This is about having a couple of donkeys, 4 wild boar, and some chickens or something, right? Mostly, as far as we can tell. But this also means that in areas where we already have pigs, these can be supplemented with new and different forms. And in areas where we're seeing them, where there are no wild pigs, they also could potentially supplement that. And in the context of African swine fever, this does give me a fever and give me a bit of a headache, in that these are effectively unmonitored, unregulated sales of swine across Canada. Where they go, who buys them, I mean, as far as I understand, no traceability, no anything. They're just gone. So that's important. In terms of impacts, this is what it looks like when you have pigs come in for 24 hours. They don't just gobble up the vegetation or the branches or anything. They rip up the ground. As we know, they're rooters. Grain bags have become very popular in Canada, especially Western Canada. But pigs walk over them, break through, and all of a sudden there's 3.5 billion calories of food in there. A huge source that helps them survive the winter. Our deer, our elk, our moose, what we mostly see as the limiting factor is late winter. February, March, we start to see our whitetails die off. We start to see our moose die off. And the deep snow, they've been, without good quality nutrients for a long time. And so late winter die off is has historically been the limiting factor. But when animals are getting to huge volumes of agricultural crops, there is no limiting factor. They just keep reproducing. And then, of course, this contact. We were driving down the road in southeastern Saskatchewan in 2017, and I jammed on the brakes and saw this, and I took a few photos, and I went and talked to the guy. I said, what the damn hell is going on here? I'm not sure what I said, but I think I swore at least once. And the guy said, oh yeah, that thing hopped the fence and moved in. He's part of the herd now. These were some outdoor sows. He was a very basic, pretty not great situation. These pigs were, the domestic pigs, the first time we drove by, they were on the other side of the road, because of course you get 3 feet of snow, and they actually walked over top of the fence, and we're having a visit across the road, and as we came, they knew they were in trouble, so they ran back in, but this guy was with them, and I started saying, like, I got to get this thing out of you, away from you. All I want to do is take it and bolt gun it and just bury it. And I said, like, I'll give you $400. I'll give you $800. I think I offered him $1,600 cash. And he said, I don't care what you say. I'm not selling it. It's part of my... And in fact, that spring, the Reeve, which is the head of what we call rural municipalities, which are pretty similar to your counties, the leader went over there, and they actually got into a fist fight over this, because every single piglet had those horizontal cream-colored stripes. This pig had clearly sired all of them, and so they were non-intended or sort of quasi-intended offspring. But from a disease perspective, and even from an optics perspective, this is not great, right? Although I will say I've been showing this photo since 2017, and nobody's asked me where it is, and nobody's tried to do anything about it. So I would say there's still a long way to go in terms of actually addressing some of these major issues. Here's Western Canada overlapping those watersheds where we have wild pigs and where we have domestic hog barns. And you can see a lot of areas. I'm not going to go into it today, but if you want to read some of our work, we've actually looked at visitations by GPS satellite collared pigs. And some of these hog barns have major frequent visitation from these sounders and groups of wild pigs. So some farms not only are in the same watershed, which is not necessarily cause for deep alarm, but when you know those collared animals in those watersheds are physically coming to those farms hundreds, if not several thousand times in a year, that is cause for major concern. So we do have a lot of spatial overlap. We do see a lot of potential contact. And of course, that depends on the type of farm. If it's sealed up, shower in, shower out, maybe not such a huge concern. But backyard operations or anything where you've got animals accessible, they are going to try and mate with them. So they're highly attracted to sow barns from the smell, and those male wild boar want to mate. And of course, any kind of feed or spilled feed or anything is going to be an attractant. In terms of disease, we know there's lots and lots of diseases that can spread to wild pigs, and they can actually spread to domestic pigs. And of course, everything from bovine tuberculosis to bacterial to viral to parasitic, things that can go. And for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that has a reportable disease list, a little over a third of all of those diseases can be spread to wild pigs, and they can be major reservoirs to hold it, and they can be major vectors to spread it. And they have huge home ranges. If you collar our native species, deer, elk, moose, and I've done all of that, their home ranges are pretty small. The home ranges of these pigs are about an order of magnitude bigger than any of our native wildlife. So they are actually probably in a lot of ways much better suited to spread disease than any of our native. Of course, we have to worry about deer. Deer are always potential disease spreaders with livestock. They're very common on farms, but pigs are a real concern as well. And of course, you're all aware of African swine fever. We know from Europe and Asia that wild boar can get it. We've seen in the media where countries, Denmark builds anti-pig border fence amid swine fever fears. They're literally putting up a fence separating entire countries, trying to keep African swine fever out. And there are a number of models looking at spread that include wild pigs, wild boar as important reservoirs and vectors. And increasingly, I saw Greece just had ASF just the other day, and we're seeing more and more, of course, of those popping up. And so that's a major concern factor for us here in Canada. And given this widespread population, there's lots of contact. If we got ASF in domestic pigs, there's a pretty reasonable concern that it could jump to wild pigs, and that could be a real problem, especially in Canada where there is work going on ASF compartmentalization so that the entire country isn't necessarily shut down. I was working on bovine tuberculosis back in 2003, and we were at a meeting with a whole bunch of government folks, and everybody's phone blew up. What is it? Well, first case of BSE was found in cattle. And so I remember that day distinctly because, of course, that day also every single country on the planet slammed their borders shut for beef sales from Canada. And we had nowhere to sell our beef from. So we're well aware of the kinds of impacts that come from disease, even as literally a single animal. So a single animal with ASF would be indeed catastrophic. think we all know that. So, some hard realities. What do we need to think about? What do you need to know about these pigs and their presence? You can't barbecue your way out of a wild pig problem. The first thing we always hear is put the hunters out. Hunters make the problem worse. They break up groups. They spread them around. And they don't reduce the population. Because of that high reproductive rate, you find 10, they go out and shoot 6, and say, well, we killed 60%. Great. Come back the next year, and those 4 that were left become 20. And that 20, all of a sudden, they kill half of that. They keep killing and killing and killing, but the population keeps going up and up. So hunting is not your solution, and in fact, it's one of your biggest part of your problems. Sport hunting is not going to save the day. Sport hunting is going to make your problem a lot worse, unfortunately. You can have open season sporting, or, and I emphasize and bold and circle that with my little pen about 42 times, or you can have wild pig eradication. Pick one. Which do you want? Right now, the Canadian prairies have picked open season, and we have wide open season across western prairies, except for national parks and cities and a few places. But essentially, Western Canada is still today, here in 2023, wide open season. So one of, you look through a report, your kid's report card, and you're sort of intended to tell you how things are going. One of those report card things to look for is, do you have open season or not? And if you have open season, then do not pretend to tell me that you're serious about getting rid of wild pigs. There's no chance. It's not even, you pick one, and in Canada, the only province so far is Ontario has actually banned hunting of them. BC is considering it. But yeah, that's a key indicator of where things are at in terms of effort and reality. I want to make t-shirts that say, meetings don't eradicate wild pigs. Meetings are important. Hopefully you leave here today knowing a little bit more about wild pigs and talking and thinking a little bit of what this means for your state and neighboring states. But definitely need to think pretty carefully about doing things other than eradicate. One of the rules I want to make is say you can come to our meetings in Canada, but you have to have at least 12 dead pigs in your pickup and other than that, you're not invited in. And sort of what you see from those maps and what's key is what Minnesota, if you want to have success, stay pig free, prevent pigs, it's tied to what you guys do today. It's also tied very much to what your neighbors do, including Manitoba, including the Dakotas, including, well, possibly to the south as well. Wild pig removal in Canada under formal control programs in 2002 was less than 300 animals. We probably need to be somewhere in the 3,000 range per year with a real focus on whole sound removal. So I would say in 2022, we probably did about 1% of what needed to be done to start to get the population to level off. That's not eradication, that's off the table. That's not population descending. You need to be killing about 80% of your pigs every year for a long time to get them to level off and stop increasing. So we got a long way to go. And I think in some ways, there is some cautionary tales here for folks in Minnesota. Sport hunting, I said, part of the problem. These big traps can be super effective. These what we call boar buster or other brands of traps. You bait. Once you got pigs coming in, you put one of these big traps. They raise up in the air so they don't block the field of view. You have real time on your phone. Your phone dings at 2 a.m. and you see pigs and you know you've got 12 and you go 10, 11, 12. Click, you hit the button on your phone and that hole drops and all hell breaks loose. But you can remove entire sounders with these. And in fact, on Boarbuster's site, they show where they put 2 together in a figure 8, and I think they caught like 50 pigs in one shot or something. So they can be insanely effective. If this is all you're doing, you're not getting there. Traps are one part of a solution and by no means the only solution. They take a long time to set up. One Yahoo can screw this up. We've had people screw up our programs where they see where we're working on pigs, trapping, or they actually watched us one day. We were flying in a small plane and just circling little chunks of bush. We got the helicopter up the next morning, and every single one of those chunks of bush people had gone through with snow machines and shot up pigs, and we never caught one that day. So it can... we actually, I borrow my buddy's pickup, I take my wife's minivan, I drive, different vehicles and different routes, and you have to have a whole plan just to try and prevent the 1% of the assholes, I guess is the term I'm looking for. A helicopter can be super effective. It's expensive, but you also get a lot done in a short time, cover a huge area. And if you've got a couple of planes flying, you've got people on snow machine, you've got infrared camera in the helicopter, you're finding a lot of pigs, And once you have eyes on them with the helicopter, you can maneuver them out into the open. And I don't know if you could see in the image that orange net that's over top of that front pig, but there's a net fired out of here, net them, and then they're totally restrained. And you've got about 8 to 10 nets packed in there, so you can get a bunch of animals. Super, super effective. You're spending $16,000 a day, sure, but you're doing a tremendous amount of success over huge areas. So, burning question, last thing I want to touch about today. More specifically, what do? I've touched on a bit of this. There's a lot of policy things that you can and should do if you want to be pig-free. Montana is probably one of your better examples. I talked to them about 5 years ago, and they talked to other people, of course, and they said, we really do not want these things. We think we're wild pig-free. We want to stay that way. So they said, no pig hunting, no wild boar hunting or wild boar type or wild pig. None can be raised in the state. You can't even drive them through the state in the back of a pickup or a semi-trailer. You've got to go around. And so they've made a whole bunch of very, very serious and very clear policy statements that have helped them to stay pig-free. Wild pig management plan. If you don't have a plan, again, please don't pretend that you're serious about dealing with pigs. If you don't have an actual strategy on the book, forget about it. That's with a strategy is hard. Without one, you're guaranteed to fail. And most of the provinces in Canada still not have a plan. There has been a draft national plan in Canada, but here today, already we're in February of 2023, we've had pigs since 1993, we still don't have a national strategy yet, and they're still dragging out. So this notion of a fast, immediate, rapid, aggressive response, you can't make the case that we've done that anywhere in Canada. Trapping works. Judas pigs, put a GPS collar on a pig and let it go. So in that group, we killed 3 of the pigs, left one with a collar, and nothing's going to find pigs better than that Judas pig running around with a GPS collar. It can go anywhere. I can find it with my smartphone. We can go right to there and we can remove them. And ideally, leave the collared animal. It goes again, finds more pigs. Take them all out. And you can just keep doing that over and over. Judas pig works well. Poison is a controversial one. A big problem with poison is how do you get it to pigs and not to black bears, elk, deer, moose, raccoons, rabbits, dicky birds, and all of the above. So there's some challenges, but the U.S. is working really, really hard on a hog-on, nitrite-based poison and a delivery system to make it work. Sport hunting is not going to get you there. What about producers? I say swine, but I'll say largely the same to beef producers. Biosecurity. Large operation versus backyard, very different. Education is always key. I'm currently teaching, and I've been doing for a long time, a third-year class called Animals, Agriculture, and the Environment. And one of the things I tell my students in the first week is that almost any question I'm going to ask you about these challenges of agriculture and the environment, education and fencing is almost always going to be a good exam answer. So keep that in your back pocket, because I'm a huge fan of education. I'm a huge fan of fences. Fences, of course, are among the easiest pitches you can make to farmers, as it turns out. We do and have done what's called on-farm risk assessments, because part of the risk of having pigs is where you live. If you're near a big park, huge chunk of forest, or in a river valley, then your risk is sort of naturally going to be there. But also, it's your livestock, how you feed them, how you deal with spillage, how you deal with dead stock. Those kinds of things are big. I always say to every producer, go buy 2 trail cameras and put them out. And any reports, get them. Manitoba has signed up to cross North America. There's a Squeal on Pigs program that Minnesota could join tomorrow if they wanted to. And basically just emphasizing to everybody across the state, if you see one of these things, report it right away. Again, this notion that the cornerstone issue is you got to find them and then you got to act on it right away. So having a reporting mechanism but no response doesn't make sense. It's just going to piss people off and say, well, why do I bother? And we've seen a little bit of that in North America, where they get the cart firmly in front of the horse and people start reporting, but they haven't figured out what they're going to do about it yet. So you got to be able to do something and be very reactive. With that, again, I'll thank the USDA for major support for a lot of years on this. We have had some other support throughout from Sask and Saskatchewan Ministry of Parks and that sort of thing. And so some good support for what is now becoming 14 years of research. And I think it's a good time to stop. And I know I'm between you and a beer, so I won't keep you long. But if you have any questions or comments, obviously very, very happy to hear from anyone. And my job is to repeat the question, so if I don't, remind me. Thank you very much. Yes? Oh. With trapping, the government folks that trap them, they're usually using shotguns to dispatch them with slugs or buckshot. When we capture them with net gun, we restrain them and then use a penetrating bolt gun. And then we take those. There's much debate about what to do with them. You know, I was always raised that you don't waste anything, right? Whether it's on the farm or if it's a deer you harvest, you're not throwing that thing away. You're taking the meat from it and you're either using it or giving it away. With pigs, we don't really want to create an appetite for people enjoying pigs. As soon as there's any economic benefit to having pigs around, your ability to get rid of them just disappears. So we actually started giving to a food bank, and we're criticized for that by some of our partners. And so we bury those. We actually collect all the samples we can and then bury them. That's our strategy. What the government in Saskatchewan does is to sort of a thank you to the landowners that provide permission, they give them the pig to have some meat. Yes, sir.
How has it impacted your elk, moose, deer, turkey populations? Do you know how, wild pig, is it devastating those populations?
We have not had the support to do the research that should be done. We're way, way, way behind on the science. And again, part of the problem is that I'm a little reluctant to keep spending the rest of my life studying if nobody's going to fucking listen, frankly, very much. I think I'm really at the point where I'm using F-bombs, and I apologize, but we've been doing research for a long time, and I guess the point I'm at right now, today, in February of 2023, is why are we risking our lives spinning around in helicopters collecting data when nobody's listening? So that's my slightly pissed off response and my fed up response. But we've looked at prairie skinks, we've looked at piping plovers, we're very worried about those. They destroy all kinds of habitats. So anything that relies on wetlands, from farmland moose to elk, deer, we expect impacts. There isn't a lot of great monitoring among yield populations on the prairies. It's pretty mixed. There is sort of some people doing some things and monitoring. We don't have great long-term monitoring, and we haven't been on enough money to go on the ground and do kind of formal studies on that. There was a nice piece of work that just came out of Mississippi that showed pig numbers going like this and whitetail harvest going like this. And they passed each other in the night about 4 years ago. There is good evidence out of the U.S. that it's impacting turkeys, it's impacting squirrels, they go into alligator nests and eat eggs. It's impacting amphibians. It's impacting elk habitat is getting destroyed. And of course they're predators, and these things will eat young neonates as well. And of course elk are particularly susceptible because elk on their best day have one young. Twins are virtually unheard of in terms of elk. And so we know from even just a little bit of overharvest, we can knock an elk population down, take 5 or 10 years to recover. So the answer is we really don't have a hot clue yet. We just haven't had the science. And it's really been me and a couple of grad students for the last 13 years and a few undergrads and a couple volunteers. And it's been a really small group doing what we've done so far. That said, we have heard from producers or from guys in southwestern Saskatchewan or southeastern in that Moose Mountain area where they became established. The farmers formed a coalition called the Moose Mountain Eradication Group of just cattle producers who just had guns and thought they better get in front of it. And they were told, no, you can't go into the park. You guys just want open hunting in the park. And the Wildlife Federation was against it. The local federation said, no, we're excited about these pigs. This is a great new hunting opportunity. Until 2 years later, the waterfowl had no recruitment. All the nests were gobbled up by pigs. All the ducklings and goslings were gobbled up by pigs. And as far as they could tell, there was zero recruitment. And so that's anecdotal, and that's the best we have. But again, pigs do what pigs do. So what they're doing in the southern U.S. and gobbling up turkey eggs and tearing apart, lack habitat for sharp-tailed grouse and damaging habitat for farmland moose. I think the reality is it's going to have huge impacts on a lot of species. And so I think we do need a lot of research to understand that and figure out some ways to mitigate that.
Are they able to live in the mountains?
Yes. Well, we don't have any evidence of them in the mountains in Canada, but for example, in their native range in Italy, they do very well in mountains. And Italy is a good example where they do have wolf predation, and wolves probably have some effect on them there. They're fairly low density. There's not a lot of great high-quality forage. So in some places, wolves may have some impact. But the problem, of course, on most of the prairies is where we have agriculture. We've done a really good job of eradicating top predators as well. So the overwhelming majority of that range I showed you, 100 years ago, we got rid of any grizzlies, and most black bears and wolves and things were long since removed. So when pigs move out of the ag range into the boreal forest, we may see more impact. But we just don't have, the biggest thing we have in Saskatchewan is a coyote. And coyote is not taking out pigs in any numbers, if at all.
So you mentioned if we see something, we should report it. Where do we report it?
Well, here in the state, I would definitely call the USDA rep. I would call your ag rep. I would. What we do need is a good reporting strategy, and I think Squeal on Pigs is something that I would say is a great move. It costs literally nothing to sign up with Squeal on Pigs. They'll give you that logo I showed, and you can modify it. And in Manitoba, they made some beautiful stickers. And I don't know about Manitoba, but I know Alberta's given me about 7 T-shirts that I usually wear. I had one on all day yesterday. It says Squeal on Pigs. Good conversation starter. And so you can sign on for free and then spend any money you have or any amount to sign up and then have a centralized number. So, because the problem is right now, I would call a wildlife officer or an ag person for sure, or USDA state biologist or something. But definitely any of those folks I would tell and say, yeah, I saw one and needs to be acted upon. But yeah, reporting is key. That early detection, especially, and I do believe this to be true, that I think this state is wild pig free currently, but it wasn't always. And there are some knocking on the door. So if one showed up tomorrow, well, tomorrow's a bad example. They'll be buried under 8 feet of snow, as I will be. And driving down here maybe wasn't the smartest move as it turned out, but I'll get an extended visit in your great state. But no, normally, I think if one showed up somewhere in Minnesota, I wouldn't fall off the stage of surprise. And what you do about it and how you react is going to decide your fate. So you can go the Saskatchewan route and ignore it and ignore it and ignore it. And one of the things I always say about wild pigs is you can ignore wild pigs all you want until you can't, until you have a major disaster. And I think that's, unfortunately, I think we're going to sort of do some things and do some other good things in Canada, but nowhere near enough. We're going to continue doing 1% to 2% of enough until we have a crisis. And whether, God help us, it's ASF we're not really testing for PED or PERS or other things, but some disease or someone's killed on a highway or God help someone, walking is taken down by a pig. And then I think a crisis is probably what's going to push us forward. But I haven't had a big crisis yet. So I think that decision today, what you do, you're sort of like the Yukon Territory in Canada right now, pig-free, but still some concern. And, Ontario is a classic example where they found a bunch, and they're doing a lot. They have a really good strategy. They had a bunch that were actually the largest city in Canada, Toronto, the greater Toronto area. Over Christmas, there was 13 running around. They had traps out. They baited them. They caught them all, removed the whole thing. And so they've charted a very positive future to be in front of this and stay pig-free. Or you can go the prairies route and really bury your head in the sand for a decade. And once your house is on fire and you call 911 and say, save my house, the basement savers are going to show up and say, well, we managed to salvage the concrete slab that your house is built on and nothing else, because once they're here to stay. We're going to have pigs in Saskatchewan for 1,000 years because we didn't do anything when we could have and should have. So we are a cautionary tale. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So question maybe and a comment. Comment first, get your opinion. Because it's costly. There's always a shortage of money to deal with these things. In Manitoba, one of the things I think Devin Beatty counts on is for landowners to kind of volunteer to monitor traps and help out with these things. And it's in their best interest because there's so much damage to the cropland. So what do you see? Do you see that happening everywhere, or needing to happen for having an effective control program?
I think that's part of a solution. I do think, having worked on trapping, I think that to the best possible is to have professional teams as your full-time job. The problem with trapping pigs is it does become mostly a nighttime adventure. Pigs aren't coming in on your lunch break at noon, they're coming in at 2 a.m. And so I would say that volunteers to help are fantastic, but you have to have at least one person who's their full-time job, 100%, is trapping pigs, and everybody else they can pull on as an as-needed basis. Also, I agree that it's hard to find money, and I think it's very frustrating in that one of the challenges we see a lot with these kinds of issues is there's no money until the shit hits the fan, and then money falls out of the sky, and there's blank checks being written saying, we got this problem, here's a blank check, go fix it. And we saw that with bovine tuberculosis, which was my PhD research. We were talking about studying elk in southwestern Manitoba. We knew that they could spread bovine TB to cattle. I started my PhD. They said, well, we might have money for 20 collars, but not GPS. We don't know, da-da-da. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of farms went down with bovine TB. And I had all the collars. I was flying 3 planes at a time. And one time we had 3 planes and 2 helicopters in the air, and I never saw the bill for those for 4 years. We probably spent $450,000 just on small planes, never mind helicopters and everything else. And so when we have a crisis, then the money flows. And unfortunately, that money, and again, I understand how this works. I do live in the real world, but it is frustrating that when it's really hard to get money for these things that are, this is an imminent disaster. And so I think that we need to do better, and we need to find ways to get in front of it, because a little bit of money spent preventing further is a huge investment. But to answer your question, yes, of course, volunteers I think are great. And you're absolutely right that you have a vested interest to fix your own problem. The only trick that the Moose Mountain folks found is you have to have super dedicated people, because they will get people in their ranks that say, yeah, I'm here to help, but they really just want one for their freezer. And once they get one, they quit. And in fact, the Moose Mountain guys, they'll say, okay, we're going out to shoot pigs tomorrow. We're meeting at 6 a.m. at the gas station on the corner. Because they actually said, well, we're actually going to Eagle Lake tomorrow, and we're going to go in there, blah, blah, blah. And they showed up, and somebody had gone in the night before and shot the whole area up and killed a bunch of pigs and scared them all away and wrecked it. So they actually say, okay, we'll meet at the gas station. You're going to follow us. And then when we get our snowmobiles off, and just before we take off, we'll tell you where we're going. And so they have to have all these precautions, because there are unfortunately people that want to see lots of pigs in the landscape and are pretty happy to sort of muck things up. And we see this on our social media all the time. They say, Ryan, I don't give a shit about your research. I don't care about the pig problem. I want one in my freezer. I'm a hunter. And my response at one level is, you're not wrong. It is perfectly legal in Western Canada to go shoot. If you want to dedicate your life and kill 800 pigs in 2013, and you want to hunt 7 days a week for 3 years straight, that's your right to do so right now. So you're not breaking any laws, but you're also not helping. You're making the problem far worse as well. So you got to own that. So a lot of complexities. And this is, sort of maybe my final point, and then I will let you go and have a nice cold beer, is that, I think if you think of these as purely biological problems, and I would argue that's the biggest challenge in Canada overall, the single biggest issue is that most people think of this as a biological problem. We need to remove X pigs at this rate over this time, over these areas, and then result Y will be this reduction, and then we'll get ahead of it. That part is all true, but there's a huge human component to it around people that want them around, people that don't want them around, producers that want, there's a whole issue of landowner access, and people that say, well, I used to let people hunt on my land, but somebody came and left the fence open and the cows got out, or somebody drove over a bunch of my swaths and destroyed my crop, and so I'm never letting you bloody hunters on my land again. The number of those on the prairies is going up, 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 up. So there's a whole bunch of social components to this, and there are, sometimes, to be frank, sometimes the meetings with government, they worry more about who's showing up and who's speaking and who's saying this and who's allowed to come, more worried about that than the actual outcome of, are we actually going to find some solutions here? So I think we need a lot of perspective on the human piece of this as well. And I do promise now, I think I'm going to stop talking. If you want to grab a beer with me, I would gladly tell you a lot more about wild pigs over a beer. But I'm going to stop there and just say thanks so much for coming today and for sticking around, and awesome questions and discussion. So have a great rest of your day, everybody. Take care.